Hello. I mean, isn't that the most catchy intro to any YouTube show you've ever seen?
Dun, 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 dun. Yes, Ben, it is.
Anthony and Ben. And McKenna liked it too, so there's 3 fans of it. So at some point, I'm going to make it my ringtone. But anyways, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Anthony,
Uh,
we're back
Ben,
with
yes,
another episode, as it
we're
seems.
back with another episode, Ben.
So we kicked this off last week with the first preview of vector search and REST API. And we did things a bit quick because we never told people on how we even enabled that entire environment to facilitate the vector search and everything. So
Right.
basically all people saw was a SQL server, but there's a couple of things happening in the background, quite obviously. And we
There
promised
is.
folks that we're going to walk them through that. So let's stand up to our promise. Anthony, show
Ben,
them what you did there.
one of the things that you have to do when you stand up vector search in SQL Server 2025 is to configure a model. And that model has to be accessible over HTTPS by an operating system level trusted certificate. And much like anyone in IT that's worked in tech for 25 years, like me, no one loves certificates, except, well, maybe those security folks, because they provide a lot of value inside of infrastructure. But that's quite literally
Yeah,
another show, Ben.
security, that's
All right.
overrated.
So, what I wanted to do is use Docker Compose to help give you, the viewer, and the community the ability to go ahead and just start up the system without any of that friction, right? Be able to start up SQL Server, start up Ollama, get SSL access into Ollama so that you can just get started doing the work of vector search without the infrastructure pain. And so that's what we did here. And so we're going to walk through some of that code today. It's architecture and just do a demo. I think it'd be fun to go through. And so the first thing to talk about is where to get the code. So if you go to my GitHub, github.com/Docentino, you'll find a repo, Ollama SQL Fast Start, which is where all this code lives. So you just go ahead and pull that all down, and
Check
you're
out the show notes.
quite literally one line of code away from a running environment. Going through here, you can see I kind of have a description of what's happening in the system. So here's an architectural overview. Certainly, we're going to start up a container running SQL Server 2025. Ollama, which is going to be our model in this infrastructure. With SQL Server 2025, it doesn't have to be Ollama. It can be any HTTPS accessible API endpoint that speaks the large language model that you need. Nginx is going to help us be the proxy between SQL Server and Ollama because Ollama natively doesn't have the facility to run an SSL certificate. So we're going to use that as a front end proxy. And I have some containers in there that are just kind of doing the work for us with regards to pulling models and generating certificates and things like that. I also have a blog post walking you through this in the goriest detail that Ben loves me to describe things in. And you can go ahead and find that also in the show notes. So let's go ahead and get into some code, Ben. What do you think?
I love that.
Cool. So here I am in VS Code because I use a modern tool, unlike in the last episode where my counterpart here used Azure Data Studio. Pour one out
Challenge
for you, homie.
accepted.
Pour one out for you, homie. So one line of code. So let's go ahead and grab this. We're leveraging Docker Compose to kind of stand up all this infrastructure and do all the work for us. I'm going to copy that in my clipboard, paste that into the bottom here, and hit enter. What that's going to do is all the work that we've defined in the Docker Compose file. And so let's go ahead and look at that Docker Compose file. So in the Docker Compose file, we're
So
going to find
hang on. So basically,
what's
what
up,
you're
Mr. Ben.
saying is, I pull your repository from GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
I run this one single command, and I'm done.
Yeah, basically. But since you're watching this video, I'm going to walk you through this line by line because that's what I do, Ben. That's what I do.
Anthony as a service.
Haha. Wait, AS? I don't know. That can get a little bit tricky in the autocorrect, Ben. Anyway, that's not why we're here. So, inside a Docker Compose file, you have these things called services, and each service effectively is a unit in the infrastructure that we described in the README. So, I have the config service, which does the SSL work. I have the Ollama service, which stands up an Ollama container. I have a health check on this container because I want to wait for this container to come online and be responsive to requests. So that's what you see a health check there on line 14. Ben, let's talk about what we have here from a GPU CPU standpoint for a second. So we're running a Ollama container inside of Docker Compose.
So what you're saying is, let's talk about what we do not have in terms of a GPU component, right?
Correct. So there's some, let's just say, some rougher edges around running GPU acceleration inside of Docker containers. Again, this is about first steps, this project that we have here, not production grade stuff. So the embeddings and all the searches that are going to happen inside of this infrastructure are going to be CPU accelerated, not GPU accelerated. And so some of the ways that you can make this GPU accelerated, certainly on my system here, I have a GPU. So I could, rather than running Ollama inside the container, I could just run it as a native service on my local desktop, and then I would have access to the GPU. But again, remember, this is about first steps and just getting started. So we're kind of bolting everything together.
However, I got people covered there. So it sounds like a new episode coming up.
Love
Because,
it.
I mean, let's face it, most people are still running SQL Server on Windows. It is what it is, and it's probably not going to change. Sorry.
I know.
So I wrote a little script using PowerShell and Chocolate and all that will basically kind of do what you did there.
Right.
It's not as neat. It's not a single line of code. So I'm not going to fool anybody on that. But it's automating it as good as possible. So we're going to walk through that in a separate episode because that will actually stand up all these components as native installs on bare metal. So
Right.
that would then actually make use of GPUs and stuff. So, but let's get people started first, and then we're going to
Cool.
get to that in the next step.
Sure. Cool. Love it. So once the Ollama container is up and running, we'll then front end that with this model web container, which is really just Nginx with the certificates plugged into the configuration. So that's what you see here on lines 38 and 39. Again, this is all pre-configured, so you don't have to do anything. The next thing that we have is once Ollama's up and running and we have the SSL proxy in front of that, I ask Ollama to pull a model for me. So there we see on line 52, I'm pulling the Nomic embed text model, again, just to kind of prime the pump to have it all there for you when you get into your first vector demo. But of course, on line 54, here we have the code to stand up our CTP 2.0 SQL Server 2025 container. And if you look at the volume section, we have a persistent volume for our SQL database. So you see around 66, I have SQL data. And then I also have the work to get the certificate in there as a trusted operating system level resource on 67. And I'm also attaching a volume that contains a backup because I have a sample database in the repo that we'll restore here in a second. Once we go down a little bit further, I also have another container that's just doing some work to configure SQL Server for us. So again, I think all these things laid out for you when you pull this code down and run it on your laptop or desktop. The code that runs automatically from a SQL Server standpoint configures the external REST endpoint because that's required for this. All right, Ben, let's get into the demos now. Keep in mind, we've run one line of code so far. Docker compose up, minus minus detach. And that laid out all the infrastructure for us, did all the hard work with the certificates, and got our system configured. So now let's get into the code where we're actually going to do some work with the new SQL Server 2025 features around vector. Included in the downloads is a stripped down version of AdventureWorks that we'll use as the base for this demonstration. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll restore that database to this system. Here we can see at the bottom there that command completed successfully. We'll then jump over and switch our context into AdventureWorks and create an external model. And so looking at this code, you can see on line 22, we're defining the location of the REST API endpoint to be an HTTPS endpoint, which is one of the reasons why this project exists. And then we're pointing to model-web, which is the name of the service in the Docker Compose file. And then we're pointing to the /API/embed endpoint. And on line 25, you can see the model there is Nomic embed text, which is the one that we automatically pull for you. If you want to change the model or add a new model, you'd need to define that here in your create external model code or add an additional model. So now, before we move forward, let's go ahead and test out our code. Before we move forward, let's go ahead and test out our infrastructure and make sure everything's up and running before we get into changing some stuff in the database. So that's what we have here is some code that's going to go ahead and hit that API endpoint that we just created for our external model. And there we can see we're definitely able to generate an embedding. Using the AI generate embeddings function, we're sending some test text in there to generate an embedding around that. And at the bottom there, we can see the embedding is available to us. Ben, what's up with these red squiggly lines everywhere?
Yeah, well, it seems like you didn't properly test your code. I have no idea what's going on there, but apparently I have no idea why it worked. But
Well, let's talk about where we are kind of in the development cycle of SQL Server 2025. I'm running CTP 2.0. And there's some rapidly changing syntax around things in private or in public preview, right? And so what we have here is some red squigglies because the MS SQL extension isn't quite up this, I guess, the where CTP 2.0 is from a coding standpoint. I'm sure that's going to be sorted, certainly. So don't worry about the syntax errors there. They'll get sorted out because they're just false positives today. So we have an infrastructure up and running. We have an external model created. We know that it works because we just tested it. Let's go ahead and add some vector columns to our database here. That's what we're doing there. I'm adding an embeddings column with a vector 768 and a chunk column. I then have the code here to populate those embeddings for the data in my products table. So that's happening here behind the scenes. I'm going and I'm hitting AI generate embeddings for each row in the table that satisfies the query. We're on line 65 where the embedding's not populated. So we see p.embeddings is null. Once that's done, it takes about 23 to 24 seconds normally on my laptop. But of course, this time it doesn't. Oh, there we go, 24 seconds. Before we move forward, again, because I have trust issues, I want to make sure that everything's populated properly. So I have select top 10 chunk and embedding. So there in the output at the bottom, we can see the chunk in the first column, which is the chunk that fed the embedding. There's the embeddings in the second column, or the vector representation. And then on the right there, we have the actual output of the rest of the table if you wanted to look at each of the discrete columns. What do you think so far, Ben?
This is pretty neat.
Awesome sauce. And then finally, let's do a natural language query. So line 74, I'm looking for a red bike. I don't want to pay a lot. And so I'm going to generate an embedding for my natural language query. And then I'm going to do a vector distance search in the database here on line 61, or excuse me, line 81, running that code. There we can see in the output, I have my product ID, my name, the chunk, and the vector distance associated that from a cosine standpoint. So
Nice.
again, one line of code to get up the infrastructure, and here we are doing a vector search against this database. So the idea here as a developer or a DBA to get you to this point as fast as possible. Thoughts, Ben?
This is pretty neat. I mean, the fact that, first of all, we were able to spin all this up with one line of code, so everybody can try it. But also, I'm still amazed by just the simple functionality that we're getting in here in SQL Server 2025.
Absolutely. So as you go through the demos, we have some additional searches in here. I encourage you, the viewer, to go ahead and run these. And then as you get towards the bottom, we have some stuff around vector
Whoa, 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 whoa,
indexing.
whoa. That's another
Yeah.
episode.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
another episode. We're not going to
Fine.
get into vector indexing today.
We'll pump the brakes there, but that's all in here for you, the viewer, to play with, and then come back later when we'll do a deeper dive about that. So I think, is that a wrap for this episode, Ben?
I think it is. Maybe, how do I get rid of all of this? Now everything's installed.
Ah, that's right. We do need to clean up from our demo. So going back over to,
I got a clean desk policy, so.
all right, to our test script. This is the one line of code that we ran. We did all of our demos. And so there's 3 lines of code here at the bottom. Docker Compose down will shut down all of the infrastructure, which we can do that. Let's go ahead and run that code here. Get that in my clipboard, pop that at the bottom. That's going to shut everything down. But we also have our SQL data and our Ollama models in Docker volumes, which means they'll persist between restarts. So if I did a Docker Compose up right now, I wouldn't have to pull a model and I wouldn't have to restore the database because they're there. However, if you do want to clean up that data and just reclaim that space, you can run these 2 additional lines of code here, and that will delete the volumes associated with that, if that's what you want.
Cool stuff. All right. Now it's a wrap. So here's the moment everyone's been waiting for. Let's play the music, right? And we're going to be back next week with another episode, or we're going to talk more about the REST API feature.
Cool. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Ciao.